Welcome to the 5 things you should know for single tooth implant success. It is a webinar being presented by Jimmy Stegall, MBA CDT, and we will begin shortly. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jimmy Stegall. He is a seasoned dental lab operations and management executive with more than 43 years of teaching and clinical experience in the US and Canada. He is a published author and has assisted in research projects with dentists, universities, and manufacturers. After a successful 35-year career helping to build and lead a large dental lab in South Carolina, Jimmy is now a national procedural solution specialist for Dentsply Sirona, where he has provided more than 400 clinical and laboratory educational events. As a key opinion leader, teacher, and trainer, Jimmy has demonstrated the history of proving relaxed, informative, results-oriented strategies and techniques to dental practices and labs throughout the U.S. And it is my pleasure to say, take it away, Jimmy.
Thanks, Jessica. All right. So when we're talking about single tooth implants, I think about all the times that things didn't go well, right? And this certainly can happen. And this is why we're here tonight, to try to talk about doing things certain ways that make this less risk of happening. So, there's nothing more challenging than to have a patient in a chair and look up and say, what is this? Or why am I seeing this? Or what's going on here? And it's a fact. It happens with implant restorations, and we certainly want to minimize it. And thank goodness that the technology, the science, the materials, and the techniques we're using has certainly made this easy to not happen anymore. So I like to think about it as customization. Right. In order to minimize the chance of that happening, I think of the term customization, and I think of that term throughout the whole process. Right. And that's what we're going to talk about, customization of the steps along the way to ensure that we get that success that we want, and in 5 main categories. So we'll get right at it. So when we talk about planning, right, we talk about doing surgical planning or implant planning using the technology and software available. All we're talking about is using a tool that will analyze the data of the patient and help us determine the ideal position and placement of the implants. And I'm a firm believer in using a planning software, planning service, a planning process. The digital materials and softwares and technology that we have gives us images than we've ever seen, better than we've ever seen before. And the code and algorithms to help us make the right choice and to place implants in an ideal situation, which will lead to better success. But I've been around long enough to know that I did cases like this where both the surgeon and myself said, "No, we don't need a guide here, right? We can eyeball it. We can easily see it. We can palpitate the bone. We know where everything is. This will be an easy one to do freehand." And then, in this situation, we decided to not do that. This was early on in the planning phase of implant planning. And so it wasn't a lot of software options, but there were some really good ones. And I was using one, the surgeon was using one. So we decided to do this. And so we did a plan using the data from the x-rays and determined the placement, which oddly enough were the digital plan of the placement wasn't where we thought they should be. So, we trusted the technology and, went on with the plan and built the guide from that plan and then used that guide to place the implants and then build the restorations. So I look at this case quite often today, and I think, is that exactly where we would have placed the implants if we were decided to do it freehand? And maybe not, but you'll see the results as we go on that this obviously worked, and for good reasons, and primarily that we customized the plan. We customized the placement of those implants, and then we move forward to the customization of the tissue through the customization of the provisional. And then we customize the impression post so that we could get a true customization of the final restoration, which resulted in, a great aesthetic result. So I'm a believer in guided surgery. I think that it's used more widely now than ever, and I think that's a great thing. And there are more options than ever. You could own the software yourself and do the plan yourself. You could partner with a specialist who may have the software, and they'll do it for you. Laboratories, certainly, most laboratories that do implant restorations have the capability of doing a digital plan. Surgical guide for you. And then there are online services where you can upload your CBCTs and scans of models and photographs of patients, and they will do the plan for you and propose the placement and the guide and actually print the guide for you. And then more offices are leaning towards printing the guides themselves after doing the plan themselves, or getting somebody else to do the plan for you. So, but let's assume we can customize a plan using a guided surgery. So I like to customize my view in the summer. I'm from South Carolina, so going down to the coast around Charleston is always a nice custom vacation. So when we talk about implant treatment, like, obviously we want to think about bone preservation. As a matter of fact, that used to be the number one conversation, with surgeons or implant placers, with an implant rep about, how well does the bone act around your implant or hold up around your implant? So bone preservation is critical, especially for single tooth implants, right? For those aesthetic reasons. But, none of us want to be in one of these appliances. These are certainly widely done today, and, they are fulfilling a vast need, but I don't want to wear one in my lifetime. So I want to preserve the bone so that I don't have to, right? But if occasionally, as a tooth breaks and it can't be restored, an implant is the obvious choice as opposed to a 3-unit bridge. And the fear has always been with implants, God, what happens if the bone goes, right? And we've seen enough of these cases to know this is something we don't want to deal with. But thank goodness that the technology today and the science behind the implant makeup has gotten to the point where the implant itself is very low risk that the implant itself is going to cause this bone loss. So there are a few things that we want to consider with our implants, right? And, we want our implants to work. We want them to be biologically sound and strong, and we want to be able to do things easily on them, and we want to be able to restore them any way we want to restore them. And of course, we want them robust. We want them to last. And, I joke about this picture all the time. In the implant history, we've had external connections, internal connections, and trying to come up with a word for whatever this connection was, maybe a Wi-Fi implant connection. I don't know. It's kind of hanging out there. So if you and I were to get together and design and make the perfect implant, then those are the 4-item bullet points that we want our implants to do. And thank goodness that most of the major players in the implant market today, they do those things for us, right? If you look at these images 10 years apart, and you look at the bone height around that implant after 10 years, it's hardly changed at all. And that's what we want, right? We want to be able to feel confident that putting an implant in the bone and that we're not going to see bone loss around it anymore. And thank goodness, again, we've had that. And, tissue is always the main concern for me, right? Being restoratively minded, I want to make sure that tissue is held up, and to put the right implant in is just one check on the list that I don't have to really worry about. So if I go back to this x-ray for a minute, and somebody asked me once, well, what is it that made that implant hold up so well, or the bone hold up so well around that implant? So, well, there's several key components to what is in a good implant, right? That we've seen through research now keeps the bone from receding, right? Keeps the bone healthy, actually can encourage bone growth. And so the big one, the first one that really changed the game with our implant bone health, was the internal aspect of the implant, how things fit inside the implants. I said earlier, at one point we were external hex is how things connected. And then we went to internal hex because that was a lot more stable and didn't have as much micro movement. And micro movement is the enemy, right? When things move that's screwed inside an implant, however small of a movement, it creates percolation, which means, the bad things are going to be pulled in and out of that area, and bacterial growth. So we have to have a system that locks in firmly, and that's where the conical connection came in. So we started building implants that had a long tapered interface so that whatever we screwed in it, whether it's an abutment or a screw or an impression post, this long conical connection kept it more stable. most of the major players now have that. Everybody knows that's the way you want to build the implant properly to keep the percolation from happening. So Dentsply was the first one to create that conical connection, and now most all the major players do have it. The second thing that you want on your implants is those micro threads at the very cervical portion, right? The few 5, 8, 10 millimeters of threads over these micro threads that really engage that surface bone well and doesn't put too much stress on it, but engage it well. And that means that the bone health is going to be fantastic around that. So again, Dentsply implants was the first ones to do that, but now most all the other systems have it. So again, you stay with the major players, you're going to see it with your Straumann's and Nobels and all the other popular implants out there. The last thing is that the way the outer surface of the implant is treated, whether it's some sort of sandblasting treatment or some sort of coating, that also has an impact. And, you know, again, all the major players have gotten that pretty worked out. So you can have a lot of confidence in the implants themselves. The only other thing that's changed about our implants is that now we've leaned toward, you know, what's more popular is something with more of aggressive threads, right? Everybody now has something that has an aggressive thread that will engage the bone, you know, with a really strong grip on the initial placement. And we're not as apt to put an implant in that might be spinning or might be a little loose and then just cover it up and wait till the bone osseointegrates around it. Now we're actually getting solid engagement with these threads. And once they worked out the science and angle of those threads to where we're not causing more harm than we're gaining, you know, those are now very popular and very effective, and science has proven them to be good. So the implant, we can check that one off the list, right? Use a good implant, use a popular implant, and you're okay. But to get the tissue where we want it, we got to think about that tissue from the beginning, right? I'm a firm believer that when we're doing an implant restoration, we ought to think about the restoration first and then the implant secondary. We want to put the implant that's going to support the restoration that we want to put in the space. And for the longest time with implants, right, we were putting implants in these tiny little skinny holes of tissue. We called these the lollipop crowns or the popsicle crowns. You know, it's just where, you know, you came up and out of the tissue and you built the crown to proper contour. But in order to get up and out, you had to start with a small channel. And it didn't take us long to catch on that this was not a good idea because it created a space that the patient either didn't or wouldn't clean well. So we had a lot of you know, food impaction, we had a lot of bacteria growth, and that in turn caused a lot of tissue aggravation, which in turn caused a lot of bone loss, right? So I think for the most part, I still see this occasionally. And, you know, I think we've kind of gotten the message out enough that you don't want to do this, right? You don't want to take an implant and then just do a tissue punch, you know, the diameter of the implant and put an impression post in it and go from there and ask the lab to, you know, deal with that 4 to 5 to 6 millimeters of tissue and then come out and do a crown of proper contour. What we want to do is to scallop the tissue or shape the tissue in such a way that it's more natural, that it's more like what the site would be after an extraction, right? The shape of the root, the shape of the tooth that we're replacing. That's what we ideally would like to have. And so the question becomes, how do we get there? And, you know, the easiest way is to go buy one of the stock parts that's available now. Thank goodness our manufacturers have really caught on to this, and now most of the manufacturers have what I term a anatomically correct healing abutment for every tooth site. So, you know, it may be oval, it may be triangular shaped, rounded, small, large, and basically one for every tooth. But place the implant, screw these things in, stitch the tissue up if needed around it, and it's going to heal up to that size and shape. And then we can go to restore from there. While that's not perfectly customized to each and every specific patient, it's certainly better than just putting a stock healing abutment, which might be round, it might be oval, but most of them are typically round, maybe tapered, but certainly not truly anatomically correct. So we want to customize our healing first and foremost by using a proper healing part. Because again, patients come to us for teeth, not for implants. So we ought to always think about our implant assembly as being as closely replicated to a natural tooth as we can. Size, shape, taper, emergence profile, all those things in an implant system, being the implant, the abutment, the crown, should be as closely matched to the contour of that natural tooth as we can get it. Now, early on in my career, a dentist in Virginia Beach developed this product called Contour Healer. And at the time, not a lot of folks were using things made out of PEEK, but now it's really broad based. We see it everywhere. So this guy's a little ahead of his time. And the thing I liked most about his part was that it was truly anatomically correct. He had one for every tooth. He had them for most all the major implant systems. And this became the big red button for me. So I would, buy these by the dozens and hand them out to my surgeons and said, look, when you place an implant, put this healing thing in. Let's get that tissue to where what a true bicuspid looks like. So no matter what implant, we had one of these and we'd put it in, the tissue to heal up amazingly well. And, we take it out, autoclave it, use it again several times. So this is a good option still. He sells these still today, and it's a great option. I love the shape of the tissue we get out of the contour healers. Now, this is not an immediate load thing, which has become more popular. So we have to start thinking about what if we want to put a tooth on it, right? What do we have to do then? That becomes a little bit more customized, right? In order to prevent, this case, this will live with me my whole life. This case is a real deal, right? This was, attractive patient. Everything was great. Not maybe 2.5, 3 years after placement, we saw this, and the implant was solid in the bone, the abutment, the crown, all good, but we had this recession. And, you look back and think, why did we have this? Well, if you notice, this cervical portion of the crown, has what I call a shelf or a shoulder. Because of that narrow tissue we had to come out of and build this more like a central to fit the arch. It was more kind of a modified lollipop crown. And I just assumed back then, and this was years ago, that patients would clean this well. And we've learned that lesson too. So we want to get to a point where we don't have that narrow tissue. Now, if we want to do something quick and easy, and we don't have any of the contour healers or the stock healing abutments from a company, the picture on the bottom left is just a temporary cylinder, which everybody keeps a temporary cylinder. We cut it down and we took some acrylic and we built a cover screw, and we built it anatomically correct in shape, primarily on the underside, so we can get that tissue shaped where we want it. And then you just have to polish it up really, really well. Anything you're going to place where tissue needs to heal around has to have a super, super high polish and glaze. And that's, something that we could do in a pinch. And it worked. The picture on the right is actually a custom temporary assembly that we would do when a patient needed a tooth. We wanted to maybe not immediate load it, but we wanted to put a tooth in the space. And this took some work, chair side, and I spent a lot of appointments, helping dentists and staff make these for patients. But, we got pretty good at it because it was a great solution. So customizing, the placement and the plan and getting the implant in the right place, and then customizing the tissue is critical for this overall success. And so putting this temporary in, is the best way to do it. And again, there's multiple ways to attack this beast, right? I could get just a temporary cylinder and just start building it up in composite, and just freehand a custom temp around that temp cylinder and shape it and polish it. Take some time. So as these PEEK preformed temporaries came out, I made my job a little easier to go buy something that's already prepared. And I could modify it and add composite to it, or cut it back, or adjust the margin. And so we started using those, and then just make it a regular temporary crown to go over top of that. And these are fantastic. And it wasn't the part that we were using that was the real deal. Whether it's the contour healer or making something custom like this, that's not the thought in our minds. The thought in our mind should be the tissue. We should always be focused on the tissue and doing whatever we need to do to get this kind of shape in our tissue, right? And that just means forming and shaping and polishing the underside of whatever we're putting in the site to build and shape that tissue in that direction. But this thing did a lot of these for a period because it really worked well with the tissue shaping, forming. It gave us, a lot of latitude without having to have a lot of things on hand. We could have just a few sizes of this. We could marginate the ones like this. We could get them with the margins. And so we would prep and polish, and then build a temporary, prep and polish. And we would cement these temporaries on, but leave a screw access hole, because when we place these and the patient starts healing, I wanted the doctor to have the ability to remove this if things weren't going well, right? You want to keep an eye on the tissue, especially, first couple of days, and then, every couple, 3 weeks afterwards, to make sure the tissue is going in the direction you need it to go. And if a patient comes back in, 3 days and the tissue is still really, really angry, then, we want to pull this assembly out and polish it some more, or maybe reduce it if it's pushing too hard. And you want to get that tissue in a happy, comfortable place, but you do want to kind of mold it along the way. So we may take this thing out during healing 1 to 3 times, if need be. If we're good and get lucky on the first go, we don't have to take it out, but I want to be able to take it out if we need to get the tissue happy. Now, in a lot of cases like this one, we would not put them in occlusion. This one's a millimeter shorter, not touching on the back. And we explained to the patient, look, this is a plastic crown. And, it's in there. It's not going to go anywhere, but you don't need to do a lot of chewing forces on it. And some patients say, why is it shorter? This is a temporary. We need you to heal up first. There's one from Dr. Amin, and you can see it outside of the mouth. And we always kept some analogs handy because it's just easier to screw this thing onto an analog when you've got to work on it. But you can see he had to do a couple of stitches, and, pretty happy with it. It was placement, not in occlusion. Again, we took it out of occlusion. And if you look 3 days later, the tissue is looking pretty good, right? Everything's going along nicely. So I really didn't have to do anything. And, as it healed more, I think he took it out one more time because he wanted to do a little bit more work to, help push the mesial area of the tissue around. So I can see a little bit more composite on the facial, and that's okay. The tissue is certainly pink and healthy, and we're starting to see the embrasures, fill in nicely. So pretty good. So at 4 months, Dr. Means ready to take the impression. So take the temporary assembly out and you're ready to take the impression. It's exciting, but we're going to, and we did, and of course, make the final restoration. And you can see a year and a half later, the patient's doing great, and the crown's still there, and the tissue looks good. Actually, looks better then than never. So we weren't getting any recession. So we knew we did the right thing. So we're on something here, and but it takes time to build that plastic temporary. This was one of the most exciting things to come along, and I wish it'd come along sooner for me because it was towards the end of my time of helping folks with this. But this is a part from Atlantis called the Atlantis Healing Abutment, or AHA. They give it a short nickname. The Atlantis Healing Abutment uses the science and technology of Atlantis, which is a custom abutment we'll be talking about. But custom emergence profile, custom margin placement, if not a margin placement, but what would eventually be the margin. And this thing is created digitally through digital data. So, you could send a cone beam, you could send a scan of your patient, and the software in the design software, the planning software, will create this thing custom for your patient based on the bone and the tissue and the surrounding dentition. And so really there's no work to do. Now, we can't put a crown on this. This is just a healing abutment, but it's easy, right? So we place the implant. We can scan this at placement and order it, and it'll be back in under 3 days. Bring the patient back in, slight uncover, screw this thing in, do any other stitching you might have to do, and then send the patient out the door. And this thing is fantastic because it's just that easy to place, and it's going to form and sculpt that tissue exactly. Now, the bigger win is that after healing, if you take this thing out and the tissue looks fantastic, you really don't even need to take it out to order the final, because the data used to build this is the same data that can be used to build your final abutment. And, obviously it will match because it's the same data for emergence profile, height, all that stuff, but it's just going to have a top on it now to build the crown on. So how cool is it to, place this a couple of days after you place your implant, and then come back, in 8 to 10 to 12 weeks, and everything's healed and nice. And you say, you know what, it looks great. We have had no recession. Tissue looks shaped nicely. We'll go ahead and order it. All you have to do is get online and find an Atlantis laboratory, and they will get the data from this thing from Atlantis, and they can build your abutment and crown to it. And boom, it's that easy. And then you go, the next appointment is to place. So I love this. Again, that extra couple of days period after you place the implants and do a quick scan. But it's worth it to not have to spend, the 30, 45 minutes to an hour appointment to build a temporary, custom out of the peak or pecton. Now, if we've gone to all this trouble so far, right, with the plan and with the placement of the implant using a guide and, the provisionalization, we build all these custom things to get the tissue where we want it. The last thing that we would want to do is look at that site and say how nice we've done is to stick an impression post in there and just squirt impression material in that site. That's not as customized as you can get it, right? Because we're going to get possible tissue collapse, impression material pullback. All those things can happen where we won't get an accurate picture of that site. So I'm a firm believer in customizing the impression step as well. And that can be as simple as placing the impression post and placing, 3 or 4 layers of flowable composite so that, we can see that it's holding the site as it should be, and just cure it as we go along, and then build that up to the crest or just over, and then take a traditional polyether polyvinyl impression from that. And, what that results in is an impression post that matches the site exactly. Now, if we did this, right, if we built this custom, a temporary abutment solution, we could build our impression post using this outside of the mouth and not aggravate the patient. And it's as simple as removing it from the mouth, once we're good and healed, putting it onto an analog and taking an impression of it outside the mouth. So, we would use like Blue Moose because it's set quickly, and put it in a cup, right? And so all I'm doing is capturing the underside of my temporary abutment crown assembly, right? And so the analog's down in the putty now, and I can unscrew it. And what I'm going to see is an analog down in that putty, right? Now I can put an impression post into that analog, and then I can start filling the void with flowable composite or any composite acrylic. And I always mark the buckle. That's what the era is. And, let that cure that up with the light. And what we ended up with, right, is an impression post that's exactly a mimic of the underneath of our a temporary assembly. So it should fit exactly the same, right? Of course, we're always going to go back and confirm it, right? And what we like to see when we're seating things into an implant site is we like to see a little of that tissue blanching, but we want it to go away. Science data research has proven to us now that you want your implant restorations to push into the tissue ever so slightly. The general rule of thumb is 1/10 of a millimeter. And a good rule of thumb visually is blanching. If we see blanching and then it goes away after, a couple of minutes, 5 minutes tops, then you know that you're right. If the blanching does not go away after a couple of minutes, then you're pushing too hard and you need to adjust it. If you don't get any blanching at all, you're not pushing the tissue at all, right? And that's not good either. We know that research has shown us that we also get tissue recession if we don't engage the tissue with our restoration. So you're looking for that magic, 1 to 2/10 of a millimeter into the tissue contact point. So yeah, just for, grins and giggles, I wanted to see, what an impression post would look like in this site, without being customized, and what might happen. And if you can tell, right, the buccal tissue is already starting to collapse, almost immediately after placing it. So, that's the reason that I want to customize it, to hold everything in place to get that perfect picture. So if we squirt impression material in that site with just an impression post, the tissue could likely collapse through the unset impression material and be at some resting point that we don't want it to be. So I like the customization. And for this particular case, this was direly needed. This young, female, attractive, high smile line. This is the one you absolutely don't want to see the interface down the road. And this worked out well. So, we've customized everything to this point. It only makes sense that whatever we put into the implant as a restoration needs to be customized as well. So in my opinion, the ideal abutment is first and foremost customized to each and every specific patient. And these are the things that we look for, right? Of course, we want it to replicate the natural tooth and support tissue and all those things. We want it to work. We don't want it to come unscrewed. And, thank goodness we have that today. And you can get that in multiple ways, right? You can do that with a stock part, typically called a tie base or a stock abutment. And these parts are still valid. They're not ideal, but they are valid, and we can use them. A stock part upper right-hand corner, as you can see, can be customized. We can angle it, we can marginate it, but the diameter of that stock part is a stock number. And let's say that it's a 5, and what if I needed it to be a 4.8? If I got to cut that down, that's no fun. Cutting titanium is no fun. And so, we are limited to whatever the stock parts give us. And that's not only true in diameter, but that's in shape of diameter, right? Is it round? Is it oval? Is it triangular as it should be? Most of them are not. Most of them are round or cylindrical. Is the emergence profile at the correct angle? And more than likely it's not. And so all we can depend on when we use these parts is the emergence profile from the margin of these parts up. So I can make my crown any emergence profile I want, but as you can see in the picture of the crown on one of these things, it has that shoulder. And this is my dead giveaway when I'm looking at articles or ads about, a part or piece. And if I see a shoulder on a crown, I'm immediately thinking that, hey, that's going to be a challenging area for the patient to keep clean, which means it's a potential area for bacteria growth, which is a potential future tissue and bone loss. So I'm not a fan of shoulders, right? I want to see a true custom emergence profile from the implant interface all the way up to the crest of the tissue. And the only way to do that is to create a custom abutment. I can get close with some stock parts, but not ideal. Now, the true stock low-cost abutments would be the tie base, right? Those are all cylindrical in nature. They have a pretty standard size, various anti-rotation things. And, the big popularity with the tie base is honestly just economics, right? They're inexpensive compared to everything else, but they create their own issues, right? And again, I'm always thinking about patient hygiene. And if we expect them to use super floss or a water pick or a proxy brush to make sure it's all clean under an overhang or a shoulder, as I call it, then, we're kidding ourselves. And I've about convinced myself that after 40 some odd years that no, they're just not going to clean them. The stock part also doesn't give us everything we need, right? If I'm thinking as a crown guy, right, I need support for that crown. And a stock part quite often doesn't give us all the support that we would like to have for a crown, whether it's height or width or shape. And, if you look at the graphic image in the upper left, that's say a porcelain to metal crown. The first thing you notice is look how much alloy is in that crown. And I would get the question quite often, why are your implant crowns more expensive than your regular crowns? It's just a crown, right? You're not making them any differently. Well, we aren't, but we are because of back then, we were doing a lot of PFM still, and a lot of stock parts are being used. So I've got to create the space with something. I can't build porcelain that thick, so I have to make the coping thicker, which more alloy, more cost. Plus, it's hard to make a thick coping and keep porcelain on it. So it was a challenge for us. I would much rather have the custom abutment, which creates the ideal support and margination for the crown. If you look at the real images, live images on the right from the occlusion, it's pretty clear indication, why I wouldn't want the one on the left, the stock. It's just not going to support a crown. Even if we're not doing PFMs anymore, if we're doing all zirconia, that's even worse. I think about all the zirconia that would be hanging off the mesial and distal of that stock part, hoping it, wouldn't chip or shear off. So ideally, we want this to be customized, not only underneath the tissue, right, for patient health and minimize any chance of bone loss, but for the crown itself, right? I want to have a crown that's the proper thickness, proper layers, whatever we're using to build the crown, but also the proper support. So, the custom, I can see the margin all the way around. I can't on the stock part. So I'm questioning it. Some will argue that, well, you can customize it from, the interface up. Well, not the implant interface from the crown to stock part interface. Yes. But what about below that? And what about the shape of that margin of that stock interface, right? This one happens to be a 5.5. What if I needed a 5.6 or a 5.7? But again, I got to get the burr out and really whack on titanium to try to do that. I'd much rather just turn on a computer and let a computer help me design that. Not almost right, but perfectly, because the computers are better than we are at doing stuff like that. So custom is the way to go. If we're going to create this really nice tissue and not going to poke these skinny holes anymore, right? We got to put something in that hole that's going to maintain the space and the tissue contact that we want. Now, a lot of arguments about custom abutments, right? You'll hear some implant reps say, oh, don't put that abutment on my implant or we'll void the warranty, or you really should be using implant abutments that are custom made by the company that makes the implants. I get the argument, protect your brand, you believe in what you've built, but look, guys, the people that decide on whether an implant and abutment assembly is good or bad is the FDA, not an implant manufacturer, not Dentsply, not any of the others. And the question should be, is it FDA validated, right? And if it's FDA validated, I don't care whose it is, and I don't care what implant it is. If it's validated by the FDA, that means somebody has done the testing on 100 implants with custom abutments made for those implants, and all the pushing and pulling and stress tests they do, and it passes, right? And the FDA doesn't say, hey, we approve this abutment. They say it's cleared, and it's cleared that it's as good or better as original parts. So if the FDA gives it the thumbs up, then we should all give it the thumbs up, regardless of what an implant salesman might tell us. And kind of honestly, it's just a marketing ploy to frighten us into purchasing something that, they want us to purchase. So don't fall for that. It's just marketing, but it's not meaning it's bad. It certainly isn't bad, because those are FDA cleared too. So it's okay. But there was a time when none of the implant companies made custom abutments. They all used one particular company to make them for them. And, all of a sudden they're not good, but the ones that they make are, and the science and data just doesn't back that up. So the other thing you want to ask your lab or whoever you're getting your custom abutments from is, are they fully milled? So if you look at this picture down in the bottom, right, these are what we call blanks. So those are cylinder pieces, titanium solid we can buy. But if you notice, the interface is already milled into these blanks. So somebody somewhere with a really super high-end milling machine has gone to the FDA and said, hey, we want to mill these cylinders. We want to mill the interfaces, and we want FDA clearance for that. And they will grant them FDA clearance for that as a blank. And then that blank is sold to another somebody, maybe a lab, maybe a milling center, that says, we're going to load these in our milling machine, and we're going to cut the upper part out, the crown prep, basically. And they say, okay, you said they're FDA validated. Great. I'm going to go mill the crown part. Well, the FDA don't look at it quite that way. They said, no, if you're going to buy this blank, whatever you do and whatever milling machine you use, that also has to be FDA validated. So that's a question you want to ask too. And of course you want a warranty, right? And so you want to ask folks, what's your warranty? And thank goodness you've got some great solutions there too. There are warranties that are lifetime for the implant abutment. And well, let's talk about it. Dentsply Sirona, for example, right? They warranty their abutments, which is the Atlantis abutment, for the life of the abutment. And they warranty the implant under that abutment, regardless of whose it is. So Dentsply will actually pay a dentist, write him a check for another Nobel Biocare implant if anything ever fails. In reality is they don't fail very often, right? So put an Atlantis abutment on a Nobel, you're certainly covered by the FDA, and you certainly have a lifetime warranty that if anything goes wrong. I always ask folks that want to say, no, you ought to be using original manufacturer equipment. You ought to be using manufactured parts. So, well, how about all the locators we do, right? Locators aren't made by implant manufacturers. They're made by another company. And none of us ever hesitate about putting a locator on anybody's implant. We don't ask that question, is it originally manufactured part? So, marketing has trained us to think this way. And I'm just telling you to think for yourself and, ask the reps these questions, ask the manufacturers, ask the labs. Now, when we start making custom abutments, right, we began to make custom abutments. They were all handmade, right? We would buy something called a UCLA abutment, which was the titanium interface for the specific implant with a wax or plastic sleeve that we would carve and shape and add wax to, and then cast in gold, right? When we cast it in gold, right, we'd get a true custom match of what we designed. This was then and still is FDA validated workflow. Right. And it's still a good choice, but it's the most expensive choice because it takes a highly skilled technician and, of course, the alloy cost and the part price of the UCLA abutment. Still being done on some implant interfaces because we don't always have a CAD/CAM option on every interface. That's getting better every year, but most custom abutments now are manufactured at a milling facility somewhere, whether it's an implant manufacturer or a third-party manufacturer. And most of the implants are milled today are out of titanium, either plain titanium or some sort of gold-treated titanium for aesthetics. Zirconia across everybody, every company, every manufacturer, less than 3 to 5%. Right? It's just not as popular of an implant abutment as I'd like it to be, but the only way I'm going to like it to be a popular choice is if they figure out a way to make it stronger, because zirconia abutments will break, and we've seen that more than we like. That's why they're not as popular. The sad thing about it is, where we need zirconia abutments the most is where they're least really need to be, because you need zirconia abutments to be robust. And if I'm using a zirconia, I'm probably using it in a lateral lower incisor, and I can't make those robust. I just don't have the space to do it. So not a popular one, but I'll tell you, the gold colored titanium, of course, it's titanium. So, you got a lifetime warranty with folks like Atlantis. You get a millimeter of crown over that gold, it looks fantastic. So that was my go-to forever and ever. So the move to digital really made customization better, faster, more affordable, right? And so, digitization has really helped dentistry as well as any other manufacturing, but we can really get a nice implant. And the technology, is the milling companies figuring that out. And they're buying these, $2.5 million milling machines and taking raw titanium stock and milling the whole abutment, interface and everything in one go because of the accuracy of the technology. And what that allows us on the clinical and lab side is to be able to just say, hey, we just need to send data to these people and they will mill them for us. And we'll get back a really, really great part that will, help maintain the tissue and support the crown. So all it takes is some scan posts, a scanner, right? And that file can go off to somebody that they will design it and mill it for you. Or a laboratory can design it themselves and send it somewhere for milling. Multiple processes, multiple choices of how this goes, but it's a true customization of abutment, which means we're going to hold the tissue up better. So if we're customizing the abutment, then, what are our choices? In the beginning, right, 18, 20 years ago, we started doing implant crowns by the ton. They were all screw retained, right? And then somewhere along the line, somebody made up their mind that, hey, we ought to be cementing these. It'd be easier, faster. We're familiar with, crown and bridge prep, what it looks like, margins, crown and bridge cement. Let's just make the abutment like a crown prep and cement the implant crowns on them. Okay, sounds good to me, right? And so we started doing that. And then a few short years later, we got a new term in our terminology textbooks called peri-implantitis, right? And what was happening is when you cement a crown over an implant abutment, if you don't clean 100% of the excess cement away, it'll migrate down, it'll start aggravating things, and tissue and bone don't like it one bit. And we'll see bone loss in as short as 1.5 to 2 years just from flecks of cement. And, it just became a real challenge for folks because, somebody shows up at your office one day and there's this trough around the implant. And what in the world is going on? And yeah, that's just cement left over that we didn't see. And it's impossible to see it all sometimes. So it became a challenge to do a cemented crowns. A lot of people started developing techniques about do it out of the mouth and then go in, but that becomes problematic as well. So what we've moved to is screw retain. If you would come to a lab, maybe 8-10 years ago and say, what percentage of your crowns are cement retained? And this 80-90%. If you go ask labs today, it's totally flipped. 80-90%, 95% are now screw retained again. And why is that? Well, we got tired of dealing with troughs around our implants. We got tired of failures and bone loss and tissue loss. And we said, we don't want to do that anymore. Let's make sure we do a system where that has no risk of happening. And that's what screw retain did for us. Screw retain got better because we got more options. And you'll hear terms like screw mendable, screw retain. You've got stock options like a tie base, right? We can do a crown over a stock tie base pretty easily, effectively, affordably, but with challenges. We can do what is called a hybrid tie base, where you take a stock tie base, make a custom abutment top, and then make a crown on top of that, right? So that's a hybrid. A little bit more customization, but still limited to wherever the margin of the tie base is. Or my favorite is, let's do a custom tie base and our custom abutment and do a crown over that and cement the two together. And all these things, we're going to cement the crowns on whatever we use and then just screw it in the mouth. So all the crown and bridge cement's cleaned up before we ever get to the cavity. Now, tie bases became really popular. There was a period in my career where the VA and a couple of universities and some of the people that were treating Medicaid, anything that we needed a lower cost option, and tie base was that choice. They came on the market and they were about a fourth of the cost of custom mill titanium abutment. We could buy one of these, we could scan it, or we could get a data file for it, and we could build a crown over it, cement it, and send it to the dentist, and boom, there's a screw retained crown. Now, it didn't take me about 9 months to realize these things were very problematic, and it was really based on the design. Was it retentive enough? Did it have enough anti-rotation? Some had terrible anti-rotation. And then it turned out that was about the time that we started really hearing about the FDA's involvement in implants and implant abutments. The FDA, if you don't know, has hired more people, opened more offices, done more inspections over implant abutments than anything else they've ever done in dentistry. And they're on a mission to make sure that we do it right. And turns out that all of the tie bases on the market, with the exception of one, did not have FDA clearance. No idea whether that was intentional or not, but that gave me a little bit of a fright, and the fact that I was getting about 2 to 3 calls a week about crowns coming loose, screws coming loose, or things breaking, that I said, you know what, we ought to back off of these for a little bit until they get better. And so we did, right? Because we were dealing with all the screw loosening. And then, of course, if you're using stock, like the holes are going to be where the holes are going to be, right? Wherever the implants are placed, if you put a stock part on it, you've got to deal with wherever the hole is, right? You don't have a way of customizing that hole placement. So, we were dealing with things like this when we use those tie bases. Well, as time went on, I kept seeing more and more things, and go back and analyze it. You think, well, no wonder, right? We had this skinny little short post, and we put this big zirconia crown over it, and we were hoping that it would hold up and hold in place. And what would happen is, of course, mostly screws would just come loose, or crowns would come loose from the tie base itself, and we'd have to take it all apart, reassemble it, re-cement it, and then put it back in. But occasionally we'd have a screw fracture. And again, it's just asking too much of this engineering, right? This engineering was really not robust enough to handle things like this. So, and this is a bad day, right? To get the rest of that screw out. And so I moved away from these things pretty quickly because Atlantis came with a product called Custom Base. And it's really just a customized tie base, right? It uses all the science and technology they had developed over the years for the Atlantis custom abutments, the cementable version, right? And so we had custom emergence profile, custom margin placement, and now we had custom core height, so we could build our crowns or support our crowns, but we could also move the hole where we needed it to be, right? Up to a certain amount of degrees. But now I've got confidence again because I'm starting at the implant interface. I'm customizing from that point all the way up to the crest with the abutment and the crown. So it felt a lot better. Now, did it cost me more? Yeah, absolutely. Cost a little bit more, which means, the dentist and the patient might pay a little more, but I slept better at night when I started doing this. Very happy with the custom base, and started looking back at some of the x-rays and thinking, you know what, hindsight is easy, right? And this case was one that drove us crazy because nothing would break, but it just kept coming loose. The screw kept coming loose. And we finally got, smart enough and got a good enough image that we saw that the rim of the margin of the tie base was hitting a piece of bone, and it just wouldn't allow us to engage the last thread or two. Now, there's no guarantee that had we cut that bone a little bit and got that thing down in the last thread or two, that it still wouldn't have come unscrewed, but felt a whole lot better with the one on the left, right? For the all the way in, all the way seated, all the way engaged, all the way torqued, and then customized from the interface up. So I became a huge fan, right? And the different images will help tell the story. If you look at the two on the left with the stock part, you look at things like, where is the margin? Where is the porcelain thick or thin? How much crown support is there at all? And then where's the screw hole? Right? It's clear that if I'm in your chair, I don't want that, right? I want the one on the left. I want the customized. I want the tissue supported exactly. I want the true emergence profile. And I certainly would like the hole in the right place so that aesthetically, or, not weakening the crown with putting the hole in the oddball place. And you see two of them on the bottom right that, it's clear it's what any of us would want. So Atlantis Custom Base became my go-to for a screw retain solution. Now, for about a year, anteriors were kind of out of the picture because you couldn't do a screw retain custom base in the anterior because most anteriors, right, the tilt and angle of the bone meant that the screw hole, even though custom base, I could tilt it a little bit, I couldn't tilt it enough on anteriors. So what Atlantis did, I think, was genius. They added another engineering step to this process to where they could take an Atlantis custom base and engineer a 30-degree, up to a 30-degree screw channel, right? Which is fantastic. But then they had to figure out a way how to tighten the screw if you're coming at it from 30 degrees. And so they had to develop a special top for the screw or special screw, and then a special tool with a hexabular design that could engage that screw even up to 30 degrees and still get the torque that we needed. This worked really well. And because the screw was encapsulated in between the crown and the custom base, that meant the hole only had to be big enough to put the tool in, not put the screw in, which is how most all other systems are, right? They leave the hole big enough so you can get the screw in the hole and then get the tool in the hole, which means on laterals, you're never going to be able to do it because the hole would be just too big, for have any substance to the crown. So the whole trick is you got to remember that you got a special tool, right? You got to remember you got to use this tool. And I get on them all the time. I said, this tool needs to be bright pink or have stripes on it or something, because from across the room, it looks like a worn out number 8 round burr, which I would throw away. Obviously, you don't want to do that. And I can look down in the screw hole, and it's easy to confuse that screw with a like a tri-lobe screw from Nobel. So when we put them in, most of the time we do this in the lab, but some dentists want to do this, and that's fine. In some cases, you might have to do it chairside because of undercuts or angles or path of insertions. But I got to ask what cement. I use Multilink from Ivoclar a lot. It was the go-to, had the strength, easy to use, easy to clean up. I switched to Calibra simply because it was chemically almost the exact same, and it was much less expensive. So I bought these little clamps, grip clamps from Lowe's. They have a 6-inch version that's great for when you put the crown on, you just clamp it in and let it set up, so we don't get any lift. Now, this was from way back when we first started doing implant screw retain crowns. And the way we filled the hole was that we took a cotton pledget or a little piece out of a cotton roll and packed it down in the hole and then put composite over it. But if you've ever done that, or if you've ever seen one of those after a couple of years, if you uncover, there's no way 100% guarantee that we can seal a hole with composite on a zirconia or ceramic crown. So we got leakage, and the cotton looked really bad. It's the black. And so most people now have switched to Teflon tape instead of cotton, which won't do that, which is great. And that's pretty common, $1 a roll at Home Depot. And so now we just wad up a piece of the Teflon tape, fill it with a posterior composite, and boom, you're good to go. Easy peasy, right? Now, I recommend to folks that if you're doing one of the screw retain angle screw access, whether it's this one from Atlantis or any of the others on the market that require a unique tool, if you ever uncover this crown or anybody else ever uncovers this crown, I would like a red flag, right? Hey, this screw head is unique. You need to go get the right tool. I would like it to jump up at me and say that. So I found out that at Home Depot, you can get different colors of Teflon tape. So, why not get a roll of bright pink and pack it in this case so that if we ever uncover it with it, oh, what's this pink? Oh, yeah, now I remember, and then go get the right screw. Seating jigs, big fan of seating jigs, right? Either have the lab make them or you make them out of some light cured composite really quick. This is what we did on most cases that were not Atlantis, because Atlantis, we could get this one, which Atlantis does, and it's 3D printed and it covers all the way down to the margin. And, everybody loved the seating jig from Atlantis. They call it Atlantis Insertion Guide. So AIG, they like to give acronyms to everything, but I loved it when I was chairside helping, because covering the margin meant this helped us get that abutment down through that tissue, you know, and helped us keep the tissue out of the way a little bit until we got the abutment fully seated and got a couple of turns on it. So, but you want to use one of those things for sure. All right, let's talk about moving to digital, right? And why am I showing a cotton field? Well, I have a farmer friend, and if farmers can go digital, we can go digital, right? This in his tractor, when he's planting cotton, you know, in the spring, the tractor is driven by a computer. He literally starts it on the edge of a field, and through a satellite, boom, it drives it across the field, which is a mile across. It's amazing. And it's planting the cotton to within a quarter inch of where it was last year. It's incredible. So if he can do it, right, we can do it, right? So yeah, most people are doing traditional impressions still for implants, but if you've got an impression wand, you should be using it for implants, just as it is good for fixed teeth, fixed dentition. It's great for implants because this gives me anxiety, right? 8 screw posts, 8 impression posts. That's a lot of anxiety chairside to make sure we get a good impression here. And you really got to get a good impression. Moving to digital means, you know, I screw in a post and I wave the wand around, right? And I'm oversimplifying, but it's so much better and so much less stressful because you can take your time to make sure you get the data, whether it's one or multiple, right? This is the way you should be doing it if, again, you have the intraoral scanner. And you have options here too, right? You can send it directly to an implant abutment manufacturer. You can send it to a laboratory, which, by the way, data tells us that 93% of custom abutments are through the lab workflow. So there's only a few folks that do this, because if you do this, then you got to be the lab guy too. You got to look at software. You've got to check abutments. You got to make sure the design is right. Then you got to let the manufacturer know, and they will mill it and send it to you. And then you got to go back and do the scanning again to get the crowns made. So with a lab workflow, all you do is scan it and send it to the lab, and the lab does all that legwork for you. They do the checking, and they do making sure that your margins are where you like them and all that thing. And, you know, then they get the abutment, they make the crown, or they can send it to you if you make the crown in your office. But, you know, again, 94% of offices are doing it through the lab workflow. Why? Because dental office might do an implant abutment restoration once a month, twice a month at best, once every 2 or 3 months. And so getting all the stuff out and doing it, you know, you got to kind of learn it over each time. And I watch offices, even the good assistants with the wands, you know, it's a 30, 45 minute, you know, process. I watch a technician put a scan post in a model, and 7 minutes later it's done and it's sent off. And they, you know, they just because they do 20 or 30 a day. Digital has really integrated in the dental lab, right? If you hadn't been to a lab lately to see some of the things that they're doing with the scanning and the technology and getting things to move along quickly, efficiently, accurately, consistently, milling processes have gotten better, printing processes have gotten better. We're printing dentures, we're printing implant restorations over superstructures. All those things are happening, but it all starts with a scan, right? You got the patient in a chair, you do a scan, that goes to the lab, and the lab can do everything from that point forward to give you a restoration. So you go from scanning to delivery to appointments, even with an implant workflow. So I had some specialists that had scanners. There's a periodontist I work with in Columbia. They had a scanner. They would do the scan, send me the file. I would do all the legwork to get the abutment and the crown. That would go to the GP, who would deliver the abutment and crown and get all the billing for those things. And the specialist didn't get any billing for anything other than the implant. They just did that as a service to their referral group so that the GP didn't have to worry about it if they didn't want to. The thing to remember about scanning for implants is you got to have the right scan post, right? Everyone is different, and you want to have the scan post that will do what you want it to do. So if you want an Atlantis, you want an Atlantis scan post. If you want to send a case directly to Straumann to get a Straumann abutment, you need a Straumann scan post, and the same with Nobel. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, but thankfully, all these scan posts now work with all the major players in the intraoral scanning. Dentsply does have something unique now called the Flow S, and the S stands for superstructure. So this is a scan post that's so accurate, takes advantage of the accuracy of the prime scan, that you can do an intraoral scan of, say, these 3 scan posts. You can send that to the lab. The lab can order the metal framework from Atlantis. Atlantis will design it, send the core file to the lab, and the lab can design the zirconia overlay and get it back and just cement it on top and send it to you. So you go from scan on a 3-unit bridge to a final in 2 appointments. And it's all super, super accurate because of the digitization. So my contact, but of course, you got a great lab with NDX that can answer all these questions for you. And I